Right now on IMF Today, there's a four-letter word floating around these buildings. Lots of people are trying to solve it: debt.
Despite having come halfway down from unprecedented levels reached in 2020, global public debt is more elevated and projected to grow faster than foreseen before the pandemic.
If this money doesn't come, if the process delays, it means that all these achievements that we have achieved so far may go into despair.
If you look at the vulnerabilities in low-income countries, you're right. We have 12 countries that are already in debt distress, and we have another 28 that are at high risk of external debt distress.
The sheer complexity of this latest generation of AI systems is in fact pretty close to the complexity of our human brains.
Hello and welcome to IMF Today. I'm Amanda Walker. We're halfway through the week of the IMF spring meetings, and today covered a lot of ground: sovereign debt, fragmentation, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. It was all on the table in a variety of events throughout these buildings. That's why we invited Ceyla Pazarbasioglu to join us today. She's the Director of the Strategy, Policy and Review Department here at the IMF. Thank you, Ceyla, for being with us. So, shock after shock after shock. We've heard that phrase a lot. So much, obviously, that's happened in the past couple of years: pandemic, Ukraine, financial stresses, more recently, a real need to adapt and be agile to respond to those unique challenges. How has the IMF managed to do that?
Thank you, Amanda, and great pronunciation of my last name. So IMF has stepped up. We have record levels of lending in the last few years. I have some numbers. I even brought them with me. We had $300 billion lent to 96 countries since the start of the pandemic. And since the fall, we have approved 23 new financing arrangements, and this is up $41 billion in terms of numbers. This includes emergency financing under our new food shock window to 6 countries. We had new IMF programs for 13 countries. We had the RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Facility, for 5 countries that have borrowed from it. So we have been not only lending with our instruments, existing instruments, but we have also innovated to support countries in these very difficult times. I also want to underline our precautionary facilities, and these are for our strong members, strong in terms of economic policies, strong fundamentals, strong institutions, and this has been, since the onset of the pandemic, $148 billion to countries like Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Morocco, with our flexible credit line, and with our precautionary and liquidity line to Jamaica, North Macedonia, and Panama. So I wanted to mention that we are really supporting member countries with our lending instruments in these very difficult times, both as insurance with the precautionary facilities, as well as with our instruments in terms of financial support.
And the big challenge that so many people are talking about, we can see there's a reception going on behind us as we speak. This is a chance for people to mingle and really digest the things that are talked about on the panels like the one you appeared on, and debt is very much on everyone's mind. There was that global sovereign debt roundtable today. What is the objective of the GDSR?
So this was a very constructive and excellent meeting today of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. We have issued a press statement explaining the summary of the meeting. So basically, Amanda, it's it's a platform that brings together creditors, debtors, as well as international institutions. It was co-chaired by our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, by David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, as well as Minister Stramanian, who is the G20 presidency. India is the G20 presidency. So it was co-chaired by them, and it included emerging market countries, advanced economies in terms of creditors, so your usual what we call the Paris Club creditors, which include, in this case today, UK, Japan, US, and France. And in terms of others who we call non-Paris Club creditors, who are not used to, who are relatively newer to these types of debt negotiations, are countries like China, Saudi Arabia, Brazil. And we had also debtor countries, Ghana, Ethiopia, Zambia, Sri Lanka, Suriname, Ecuador, as well as the private sector. So it was really a first time when creditors, private sector, official sector, debtors, and the IFIs came together. And what was, in my view, what were the key deliverables? So for me, it was a very important meeting and achieved quite a bit, because we were stuck in individual cases with several impediments. And the objective of the roundtable is not to sit down and discuss individual specific cases. That's where the creditor committees have to discuss and reach understandings. But the objective is to really identify key bottlenecks and reach consensus around those issues. And there were three that were reached today. First was on information sharing. So you may have heard about this, there's a lot of concern. When does the IMF and the World Bank share information about what needs to be done, what are the macro projections, what is the debt, what determines the needs in terms of debt sustainability. So we agreed that we will provide earlier information sharing and we'll provide guidance to staff. So we will fulfill our job. This should help unlock a lot of the discussions going forward. Second, there was a lot of discussions around what is the role of multilateral development banks. And there was push from some countries, especially China and some others, that they should be part of the debt restructuring and maybe take on some debt relief and so on. So the big deliverable from today is the acknowledgement that there are different ways of contributing, and the best way for MDBs to contribute to this is to provide fresh financing to countries as much as possible in grant terms. So that was the key deliverable, which I think this consensus around the table will also allow and facilitate quicker agreement in terms of the individual debt cases. And the third one is about the predictability of the process itself, timelines, technical issues like cutoff points and cutoff dates, as well as, for example, comparability of treatment. So technical details, which we agreed on general principles to be worked up in a workshop during the next few weeks. So I was very positive coming out of this
Yeah,
GSDI.
that's good to hear, because we've heard a lot of figures that don't necessarily present the most optimistic picture at the moment, but you see some hope, some light in the situation at the moment?
Yes, so yes, the debt is at record high levels. We actually came up with a paper. Recently we published an IMF working paper on debt vulnerabilities in low-income countries, asking this question: are we heading to a systemic debt crisis? How do we compare now to early 1990s, ahead of what was at that time put together this highly indebted poor countries debt relief initiative? So many are now questioning, are we going for another HIPIC? And as you can see in this chart, debt levels are increasing, are elevated, but they are nowhere near the peaks we saw in the early 1990s. So countries have done quite a lot to bring debt down and make sure that it's used for productive investment. So that's an important issue. And then if you look at other parameters like debt service ratios and arrears, for example, again, you see compared to early 1990s, a lot of progress have been made. But we should not be complacent. We are in difficult situation. There are countries, 12 countries that are already in debt distress. Some of them are going through debt restructuring. That's why the roundtable is so important. And we also have countries that are in a difficult situation. So we need to work with them. And I want to underline that it is critical that countries do the reforms, that we support them as the multilateral community on addressing debt problems wherever they are, case-by-case basis, and that we make sure in this way to avoid another HIPC initiative, which is, very difficult, challenging for all involved.
And Ceyla, just to finish, we obviously on IMF Today are trying to dig deep into all the detail that you've expertly given us. But to give a sense of the meetings as a whole, we can see, as I mentioned, people gathering now in a more relaxed way. We've seen the seminars up on the stage, the meetings in conference rooms. How important is it in this world where we've talked a lot about fragmentation to bring people together like this? Does bringing people together like this equal progress?
I think it's critical. And the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable is a great example. By bringing people together face to face after many years of virtual discussions on issues that everyone agrees are urgent, needs to be addressed, but that we need consensus, it's critical to bring people together. So to me, the big example is the roundtable we had today and the discussions we will have the rest of the week.
Okay, Ceyla Pazarbasioglu, thank you so much for joining us on IMF Today. Good luck with the rest of the week. Now, the third of 3 flagship reports also came out today. The Fiscal Monitor focuses on the fiscal outlook in the medium term and examines the fiscal implications of policies relevant to the global economy. Key points this round: global public debt is more elevated and forecast to grow faster than foreseen before the pandemic.
It is anticipated to start going up again by about 1.25 percentage point per year and into the medium term. By the end of our projection horizon, 2028, public debt in the world is expected to reach almost 100% of GDP, back to the record levels set in the year of the pandemic.
Department Director Vitor Gaspar is here with me now to talk about the outlook. Vitor, thank you for joining us on IMF Today. So today, absolutely, today you released the Fiscal Monitor, a big moment today. What was the headline?
The headline was that debt peaked in the year of the pandemic. It's very mnemonic because global public debt reached almost 100% of GDP at that point in time. The jump up in the year of the pandemic in debt and deficits was unprecedented. In the following 2 years, it came down halfway from the jump, and that had to do with the withdrawal of the pandemic-related support. It had to do with the recovery in economic activity, and in later stages, in late 2021 and 2022, with inflation surprises. So jump up with the pandemic, very strong adjustment down in public debt and deficits in 2021 and 2022. Now, we have a turning point with deficits going slightly up and global public debt going up again from 2023 onwards at about 1.25 percentage point of GDP per year. At the end of our projection horizon, 2028, it will be again almost at 100% of GDP, that is, back to the pandemic peak. Now, there are very strong differences across countries. This global public debt trend up is much influenced by large advanced economies, large emerging market economies, and this include Brazil, China, Japan, South Africa, Turkey, the United Kingdom and the United States, all large economies where public debt to GDP goes up by more than 5 percentage points from 2023 to 2028.
So fiscal policy and inflation are obviously big elements. What are your recommendations to policymakers?
At this point in time, we focus on inflation and the return of inflation to inflation targets in a timely manner as the #1 macroeconomic priority. And in the fiscal monitor, we make a strong case that fiscal policy can help. It can help by tightening faster, thereby containing aggregate demand and making it possible for central banks to increase interest rates by less and still deliver on the inflation target.
Okay. Vitor Gaspar, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, we learned from the Fiscal Monitor this morning that the fall in debt levels over the course of 2021 and 2022 were the largest on record in 70 years. But there's still a way to go. About 15% of low-income countries are already in debt distress. Another 45% face high debt vulnerabilities. And about a quarter of emerging economies are at high risk. Today, 2 seminars examined the issue, one on how to tackle soaring public debt and the other on spending well and with accountability. In the first, a lot of the discussion focused on Zambia, one of 3 original countries to request treatment under the Common Framework. That's an initiative by the group of 20 major countries to help especially low-income countries get through the pandemic.
Our belief, our hope is that the solution will be achieved sooner rather than later. And that some of the experiences that we have faced and some of the challenges that we see in the Common Framework will be a lesson learned from the Zambia experience as we refine some of these challenges going forward, so that the countries that will come following the Zambia footstep will not have this long wait before they put in place the structures that need to be put in place and therefore deliver the Common Framework.
The complication, and I think Felix just outlined the difficulties here, is that debt restructuring is a long and complicated process. It's not something that is completely in the hands of a government. It's the beginning of a conversation. And what we conclude is that that's an important part of the package. It should be thought about in the context of other types of measures. And this kind of conversations may need to start early because they will take some time to get resolved. And you know, as we have the example here, it can take years, months sometimes before we have a successful resolution on that front.
And after that seminar ended, a second started discussing spending well and spending with accountability. And some key distinctions were made.
There is always a strong case for spending well and spending with accountability, but no more important time to do so than now. And so this is the context in which countries must then, make sure they're setting very good priorities and making sure they have transparent processes in the budget to actually have those priorities delivered upon through their budgets.
When you spend well, that is not necessarily responding to all the demands and needs that you have in society. And sometimes you face the sort of constraints and distortions that emerge in small states.
And following on from that conversation, a panel this morning focused on the challenges facing low-income countries and concessional financing. French President Emmanuel Macron could not attend in person, but he did send a message calling for action before the Paris summit in June.
Il nous faut d'ores et déjà utiliser les instruments que nous avons mis en place. La facilité pour la réduction de la pauvreté et la croissance, mise en place par le Fonds monétaire international, PRGT, selon l'acronyme anglais, est un instrument qui d'ores et déjà permet de réduire la pauvreté, de répondre aux besoins urgents pour les pays à plus bas revenus. Et c'est pourquoi nous avons décidé, et nous sommes aujourd'hui dans, je dirais, le mouvement et l'ambition, et nous avons décidé, la France a mis à disposition de cet instrument 1 milliard de droits de tirage spéciaux, assorti d'une subvention de 130 millions d'euros pour baisser les coûts des prêts, dont 40 millions ont déjà été versés. Nous avons besoin que tous les pays ici présents en fassent de même.
And we heard from another high-profile leader at today's meeting who also appeared virtually. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky joined IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva and World Bank President David Malpass in a discussion on how best to support Ukraine's financing needs.
Thank you for the new program with the IMF, which is an important stabilizing factor for Ukraine. These will help us continue to fight. But in order for people to return to Ukraine, for the aggressor to lose not only on the battlefield, but truly in everything, we need the approval of the support program to cover the priority projects of fast recovery. The total volume of such projects is 14.1 billion US dollars. Our government officials who are now in Washington will present the details.
Volodymyr Zelensky there, his country still suffering from a war that has affected the world, most directly its neighbours. Earlier, I caught up with the Polish finance minister, Magdalena Rzeczkowska, and asked her about the success story that is the integration of Ukrainian refugees into the Polish labour market and what the world can learn from that.
Ukraine is our closest neighbor, and what we share is the culture, and also languages are similar. And many Ukrainians have already been working in Poland and living in Poland before the war. So it was easier for refugees to come and to just accommodate in Poland. Yes, welcoming atmosphere. And what we managed to do, and I think that this is the key of the success, that people are everywhere in Poland, Ukrainian people. They are not living in special places like accommodation centers, but they are just treated and they live like ordinary citizens. There were special laws introduced in Poland just after the outbreak of war, which allowed for faster legalization of the stays, and also to use our healthcare system, to use school system, schools and preschool help. And also the situation on the Polish labor market, because it was easy for the whole system, for the labor market, to create almost 800,000 new job posts, mostly for Ukrainian women, because 83% of refugees coming to Poland are women who want to work and also who need help with care for their children. So children use schools and preschools, as I said.
And you can see the rest of that interview at imf.org. Now, the IMF and World Bank Group have a parliamentary network. It gives more than 140 countries a place to call for more accountability and transparency in international financial institutions and development financing. Liam Byne is the chair of that group, and he joins me now. Thank you very much for being with us. So, the job of this network, if I'm right, is to essentially bring concerns to these organisations. What are the big concerns that you're hearing from constituents right now?
So we have 2,000 parliamentarians in 140 countries, and what the spring meetings do is they give us the chance to actually bring constituency level issues to the top of the IMF and the World Bank. And what we see now are what we call the 7 giants standing in the way of achieving the SDGs and the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So want, disease, hunger, lost learning, conflict, debt, climate change. And right now, because we don't have a deal on debt sustainability, we don't think that we're going to defeat those giants and hit the SDGs or indeed the Paris Climate Agreement. So debt sustainability, I would say, was the #1 issue that came up in our meetings this year. But of course, looming large over all of that is the fact that we have best case scenario, maybe 1/3 of the climate finance that we need for the future on the table. So I think I was really struck this year by just the sheer complexity and breadth of the issues that parliamentarians needed to talk about. And frankly, we're still a long way from having the scale of the solutions that we need in place.
And you've, I'm sure, been speaking to hundreds of policymakers, key stakeholders this week. How do they view the policy trade-offs when it comes to debt and climate finance?
It's super hard. So for a lot of parliamentarians, they're juggling with budgets that had lots more debt than normal going into COVID because, for example, they were borrowing to build infrastructure. Then COVID hit, created a whole load of new pressures. Now they're exiting and, you know, they may have challenges where they've got children in their schools that are down to 1 meal a day. They may have parents who are having to go further and further afield to find water for animals. Often that means families making really difficult trade-offs. So girls are sent out to get married much earlier. Boys are sent out to work. It means they're not in classrooms learning. And the risk for the world is that we don't capitalize on what's called the demographic dividend. So we have 40% of the world's population under the age of 25, most in the global south, in low and middle income countries. If we don't make sure that those children are in school, then frankly the planet is going to miss out on this enormous opportunity. Unless we close the opportunity gap for children, we create an opportunity cost for the entire planet.
Right, so what's it going to take to galvanise the political will to deal with these challenges?
So look, the truth is that we built the Bretton Woods institutions for a different era. We scaled them up 10 years ago for, you know, maybe one crisis in a decade. Now we're dealing with multiple crises all at once. And so the truth is that if we want to give the Bretton Woods institutions a bigger mission, then we're going to need to build a bigger fund and we're going to need to build a bigger World Bank. And, you know, there are some reforms that we've got to go through, the evolution process at the World Bank, for example. You know, there are reforms that the IMF is leading around the use of special drawing rights. But, you know, for us in the parliamentary network, I don't think we can get away from the bald truth that we're going to need to build bigger international financial institutions for what is the age of the shockwave.
Do you feel in this environment, just briefly if we can, do you feel like this is the right place for that kind of progress, for those connections? Are you punching through?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, there's no cry more potent than the cry of a hungry child. And what our parliamentarians have been able to do with David Malpass and Kristalina this week, as well as a host of policymakers, is explain how that feels on the ground. And ultimately, you know, it's mobilized. That's how you mobilize both the ambition and compassion, frankly, by telling the stories of the people that we came into politics to serve.
Okay, Liam Byrne, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now, it's day 3 of the meetings, and there's definitely a buzz in the corridors of IMF HQ. The vast atriums are filled with journalists, delegates, ministers and bankers, here to connect and here to reflect on some of the pressing economic issues facing the world. With the pandemic era now hopefully fading into our collective memories, there are signs everywhere you look, certainly behind me right now, that the meetings are back in person, that people are here and ready to connect. And while we're still recovering from the financial impact of COVID, there is really a sense of renewed vigour to act and repair. But in this series of meetings, it's not just people taking part. AI is starting to weave its way into proceedings. ChatGPT, an AI chatbot, helped formulate one of the questions for Gillian Tett at Monday's Inspired discussion. And today, the entire first session of the New Economy Forum was devoted to artificial and assisted intelligence and the risks of it taking over.
As we explore the opportunities presented by AI, we must also recognize, understand, and deal potentially with the negative implications, such as job displacement, incitement of violence, or even invasion of our privacy. Now that's scary. With great power comes great responsibility.
I think in order to effectively roll out and govern these systems, you yourself need to understand them well. But we need to be also prepared for the potential scenario that these AI systems will gain a human level of intelligence and will be able to displace essentially all cognitive labor and also all physical labor, because the robots won't lag far behind. And some of the scenarios mapped out by the leading AI labs foresee this to be happening in the current decade.
So 2 full days left of the 2023 spring meetings, but there's no winding down. The schedule is still packed. Tomorrow begins with press conferences from the president of the World Bank Group and IMF managing director. We also have the first three of our 5 regional economic outlooks. We have 2 seminars, beginning with one examining digital transformation and young entrepreneurs in the Middle East and North Africa. The second is the debate on the global economy. And in the afternoon, there'll be a cultural event with the Moroccan delegation in the HQ1 gallery. Well, thank you for joining us on IMF Today. If you missed any of it, you can see it again at any time on imf.org. I'm Amanda Walker. Once again, let's leave you with some of the best pictures of the day. See you tomorrow.